All right. Hi, everyone. We're back. Paul and I are talking about innovation. We're going to first go take a quick peek at our work mat. Just want to remind everybody of what we've been talking about. So if you'll give me a second to share my screen. Paul and I have been talking about some of the important aspects of innovation success and some of these factors that we've defined in our work mat. In previous conversations between the two of us, we've talked about the importance of aligning your strategy to your innovation work. We also have talked about the importance of aligning governance and what governance means from an innovation perspective. Today, we're going to be talking about the structure, function, designs, processes that help enable innovation in your organization. So I'll stop that sharing of the screen. And Paul, I'd like to throw it to you first. Let's talk about a set of sort of common principles that you and I share around what we think about when we think about function, design, and structure.
Yeah, I think we've got to get a definition here to begin our conversation. And I think what we're dealing with here in function, design, structure, process is the entire end-to-end process for innovation. It is the workflow and the associated roles around that workflow. And that becomes a critical aspect of what innovation does in performance and in ability to interact and align itself with the rest of our work mat. Do you want to add to that, Jeffrey?
I'd like to maybe add to it, but also throw it back to you. When we talk about the end-to-end process, and I fully agree with that because you know me, I'm a process guy. I like to think about where do ideas come from, where do needs originate from, and how do we move those needs through some sort of a mechanism or process to arrive at some sort of a product launch, because ultimately we want to launch those ideas. But a lot of that also involves design and design thinking and just larger organizational principles. Can you talk about some of the ideas of designing something like that?
I think we've got to be very careful when it comes to building out a structure process. Why I tend to, there's a little bit of creative tension in what we tend to see this area. If you call it structure and processes, it can get locked into very much what the rest of the organization is always attempting to try to achieve. You know, order to cash, increase productivity, all of those things begin to come out. The creative push is to say, but if we loosen it a little bit and we give a little bit more opportunity that it has a bit more flexibility in its design and its function, we're given the opportunity of innovation, the ability to adapt, to respond, and to adjust. So at the beginning of let's say innovation process, it isn't ideas you start with, but it could well be a particular environment that you bring together people, such as a design thinking environment, where you're drawn in a lot of different types of people in their discipline and their functions. You're saying, we've got a set of challenges within our organization. What we should be doing is exploring those challenges, and out of those challenges, we might begin to come towards some sort of ideas that we could then come back to and say, can we see them fit within how we want to take this forward within innovation from a, can we design it? Can we improve on it? Can we test it? Can we then try to commercialize it? So you then go into more of that processing stroke structure. So I think there is this creativeness that you need between. So I don't want to start with saying everything in structure and process is rock hard, because I think that's not good. And we're in an environment today where there's a lot more need to be flexible and adaptable and responsive. And structure and process sometimes get too rigid. So by having more openness to thinking about, yeah, we can be more flexible within our design, within our function. What do you think, Jeffrey?
Well, I really like the idea you've introduced of creative tension, because there is a creative tension here. When you think about processes or functions, a lot of organizations immediately think of bureaucracy. How do we put in place a set of gates or stages? How do we measure it and so forth? And you and I both know that there's a lot of creative tension even in innovation. So I like to think of improv, or jazz music, where there's a lot of different sort of riffs, but you're still operating within some sort of musical structure. And that's what I think innovation needs, is it needs enough structure in order for it to work effectively. But that structure needs to be dynamic and flexible enough so that it accomplishes something without getting in the way of doing that work. So there, as you said, there's this really interesting creative tension between how much structure, process, function needs to exist, and when it becomes a barrier to doing innovation. So one of the things I often say is no business does anything well unless the people in the organizations know how to do it and they've done it repeatedly, which means there's an introduction and a need for some methods and some processes. But innovation is so different, so unusual, so dynamic that it can't be weighted down with too much structure and process. So there's a really fine point here, and it's one of those things that you sort of know it when you see it. I don't think you can dictate it, of the right amount of process, function, structure. The other thing you said I think is really important earlier, and I'm going to toss it back to you, is the idea of what roles do people play? Because we don't talk just about like a process without thinking about how people plug into that process, or a function or a way of doing things, without thinking about what do people do? How do they know what to do? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, firstly, I want to just finish off what your point there is. I feel sometimes innovation is a bit like a washing machine. It basically repeats, rinses, washes. And it should never be a washing machine from my point of view. It should be a very efficient, effective mechanism or machine to be able to take all sorts of different types of innovation through a system, be that radical, be that distinctive, be that
Right.
incremental. To answer your question, I mean, you always have to answer within your structure and your processes. Is you've got to define who's going to be responsible for innovation. So that's got to be part of the structure. You've got to also sort of say, well, what type of techniques, tools, methods are we wanting to do? There has been in previous years very popular sort of a stage gate method or something like that. I'm less enthusiastic about that, as maybe other people are. But then you also have to say, well, how do I make innovation flow, that whole workflow, that process? How do we develop that? How do we define it? How do we believe it's going along? It doesn't have to be, oh, it must follow this, and this as its process, but there you can see it's moving in the direction you're looking towards for your next step and your next investment stage. And I think also you've got to have within your structure, the team environment is, you've got to recognize the team has got to learn from this.
Yes.
You've got to protect your team, you've got to build your team. And structure processes are good because they will give people a word that I was going to bring out earlier, but I now bring out, is hierarchy. It needs hierarchy in its principles. It needs a hierarchy in its approaches. It doesn't necessarily need to have a lavished hierarchy of lots of different layers of people, but it does need to know and point towards where decisions are going to be made, how that's going to help the process along. And also critically important, the final point is for me, is structures and processes, even function and design, has to have outcomes. Get to an outcome. And if we don't have that structure possibly in that process, if we don't continually look towards moving something along, you won't get the type of successful outcome that innovation requires. I've added quite a bit there, Jeffrey. Any thoughts?
I want to go back to one thing you said that will illustrate the dynamic tension. I think a lot of innovation is around discovery, experimentation, and learning. And if you're in a very rigid process, a lot of times you look in an organization, those processes already know what they're doing. So they're not interested in new learning or new discovery. That's why this more dynamic, more flexible innovation process or model we've talked about needs to leave room for exploration and learning. If it doesn't, then it reduces the scope and nature of innovation work. So I think we could think of it as a learning model in the front end and recognize the need for it to be more dynamic, more flexible, more scalable. The other thing I'd wanted to talk about is you mentioned people. I like to think of it as not just people, because there's people doing that work, but there's also a question of what I like to use the word is location. So a lot of people will argue that, well, our innovation team is our R&D team, or our innovation team sits over in the ivory tower in the innovation team over in the corner, or our innovation activities take place within our product groups or business units. I don't think there's a right answer, but I do think it's wrong to think that innovation resides in one place in the organization. We should definitely have innovative R&D organizations, absolutely. But out of them, you're likely to get technology innovation. We also need to be innovating our processes, our services, and our business models, and you're not going to get that kind of innovation out of your R&D team. So then it becomes important, and this rolls all the way back to strategy and function. If I have multiple innovation activities underway in multiple places in the business, all the more reason to try to have more common methods, processes, and the next thing we'll talk about is common language. Because ultimately, all these things are going to roll up to someone who needs to make decisions about these ideas. And if I'm looking at apples from my R&D organization, but anvils from my business model innovation team, and I can't compare them, then it becomes difficult to make decisions about where to place my investments.
I pick up on 2 or 3 things. I mean, the good old days, it always innovation came from the R&D lab.
Mm-hmm.
That's we're past that point. It's coming from the marketplace more than the R&D lab. It's coming from customers and having those conversations more in the R&D lab. It's coming from people within a market-facing role, customer service, marketing people, salespeople. They are far more aware of opportunity to create innovation. And then going back into the organization, engineers are far more today as relevant, if not more relevant, than the R&D guy, because he's able to bring together technologies, bring together a data science and sets of competencies that the pure science person has not really got the expertise to go into it. So it can come from everywhere in the organization. But what you've got to do is within processes and structures or function and design is it cannot come from everywhere because you'll be totally overwhelmed. So you've got to define, again, what you're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the value of a work mat, as we are talking around it, is there are other points within the work mat which will help to define how that flows, what that structure might look like and whatever else. Because as Jeffrey said, we need a common language, we need a common identification, we need context. And that's the next subject we're going to have. But there's another wrinkle that's coming very much into how we need to think about structure and processes, which is we have an outside in and an inside out perspective nowadays. So much more than we've ever done. We're wanting more external collaborators, networks to participate. Do you have a rigid formal structure that you say that's the way we're going to work this together? Or do you find a way that you can say, look, this is our structure, but we can recognize in conversations with you that there needs to be a mashing up between yours and ours. So we are capable of doing that, and we can do that with you. we may need a little bit more of change of our common language, change of our vision, change of the other things around our work mat. So the outside in, inside out becomes pretty important in today's world, where we are looking from far more external guide and expertise. Don't be really rigid on your internal structures and processes from that perspective.
Yeah, I think you've raised an interesting question around, it's different to do innovation just within your four walls than it is to do innovation with partners. And I think the more that you work with partners and the more we're going to need to work with partners, I think you need to have a certain set of things that are important to you that are must-dos, but then you must have a lot of flexibility around how you innovate, especially as you innovate with partners, because if you're too rigid or too narrow in your thinking or your way of working, the partners or the people that you need to work with aren't going to be able or want to work with you, which is the point I think you're making. Again, it comes back to a set of how do we work and who does that work that really boils all this down. So I'd like to start wrapping up and talk about the couple of things that I think we should take away from this, or at least I'd like to think about taking away from it. One is, whenever we're doing innovation in an organization, you want to think about having a really dynamic, scalable way of working. Let's not even call it a process. Let's call it a way of working if we'd like, and understand what the people will do within that way of working. The other thing that you want to do is you want it to be intentional. What is it that we're trying to do, and how much intention can we allocate to it or impose upon that, so that it has not just a way of working, but a purpose or an intent behind it. The third thing that I'd want to talk about is just making sure it remains scalable and flexible. That's what Paul and I have been talking about here at the end. We need a way of working, but it needs to be scalable and flexible. Sometimes you're going to be working on really small incremental ideas. Sometimes you're going to be working on game-changing, disruptive ideas, yet you want to have some of the same methods and processes in place. So those are some of the things I'd want to think about as we take away and end this conversation around structure, design, function. Paul, last thoughts?
Yeah, a couple. We must never forget that if we want innovation to be a core within the organization, it does have to have a corporate functional structure need. Otherwise, it will be pushed into a corner. It will be sort of those funny guys at the end of the corridor. You know, if you really want to come in, yeah, you've got to play the game. You've got to have it, you know, formally formalized and structured, but you can do it. But remember, today's world, our chief executives, our board members are crying out for agility, flexibility, responsiveness. Those should be what the innovative person brings to the table. And it is bringing those through this structure and this process, this function and design activity and mechanism is going to serve the company far better than mimicking and trying to draw down what the company is trying to sometimes impose on you as a rigid structure. That's my sort of final point, Jeffrey.
Great. Well, thanks, Paul. We've been talking in this conversation around function, structure, design, and hopefully you can begin to see the linkages from our work map back to strategy and governance. And in our next conversation, we're going to be talking about one of the things that glues a lot of these pieces together, which is having a common, consistent communication and language. So thanks, Paul. Look forward to the next one.
Take care, Jeffrey. Cheers.